I'd like to also begin by acknowledging the Wiradjuri people as the traditional custodians of the land we meet on today and pay respects to their elders past and present. I'm going to talk today about the aftermath of war and how Australia's Vietnam veterans who survived coped with their war experiences, the challenges they faced readjusting to civilian life and medical legacies that they continued to suffer from either illness, injury or wounds, both physical or mental. Much of what I'll cover comes from two main sources. Medicine at War by Brendan O'Keefe, which was part of the Official History series that was published back in the mid-90s, so quite a while ago. And that mainly focused on the medical treatment of troops while deployed in Vietnam. And the other is an independent study, much more recent, The Long Shadow by Peter Ewell. And this mainly focused on the experiences of Australia's Vietnam veterans after the war. Now, I worked on that as a research project officer on the Long Shadow book that was published in 2020. And I would recommend both of those books if you're interested in the topic. So with a focus on Australia's Vietnam War, I'll discuss physical wounds, disease, exposure to chemicals, and then post-war readjustment. I'll also spend some additional time on mental war wounds and try to put that in perspective somehow for Vietnam. Before I go into the aftermath of war for those servicemen and women who survived, first some figures on those who didn't make it home. The current figure we have in the Australian War Memorial Roll of Honour is 523 Australian deaths during or as a result of service in the Vietnam War. Of course, on special days of commemoration such as ANZAC Day today, Remembrance Day, we should especially remember those who gave their lives and consider the lasting impact of that loss, especially on comrades and families. The breakdown by service for deaths from Vietnam for the Australian forces was 498 for the Army, 17 for the RAAF, 8 for the Royal Australian Navy. The vast majority of those were attributed to battle or combat-related deaths. Only a shade under 100 were non-battle, a mixture of accidents and illness. Just on to physical wounds now. In war, the general rule of thumb is that about a quarter of battle casualties are deaths, meaning 3/4 are wounded and survive. Wounds in Vietnam could come from a variety of sources, including bullets, fragments from explosive projectiles, or mines. In the First World War, the majority of casualties were caused by artillery, followed by machine guns. It was different in Vietnam, where the enemy didn't use any big guns or lay down massed artillery barrages. Instead, they used rockets, mortars, RPGs, like a handheld bazooka firing a projectile, to supplement their small arms firepower. I don't have an exact breakdown of wounds for each type of weapon, but we do know that mines and booby traps accounted for 95 Australian deaths in Vietnam and 600 wounded, so that's about 20%. Overall, in the 10 years that the Australians were in Vietnam, there were about 3,000 wounded. A major factor in Vietnam was the speed of medical evacuation, or Medivac as it was known. Code name was dust-off for the Australians, and especially by helicopter. In emergency medicine, the golden hour is what they call the period of time immediately after a traumatic wound, during which there is the highest likelihood that prompt medical and surgical treatment will prevent death. For example, statistics for the US Army showed mortality from abdominal wounds in World War II was 21%, in Korea 12%, whereas in Vietnam down to 4.5%. There's other stats as well for mortality, which clearly show that the speed of medical evacuation to better level of medical care made such a big difference, and it's obviously the same for the Australians. Apart from medevac by chopper to nearby military hospitals in South Vietnam, very serious cases could even be flown home to hospitals in Australia where they could get, again, much better specialist care. So speedy medical evacuation saved many lives in Vietnam that in previous wars would have died. So in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, there were proportionally more wounded veterans coming home. For some, especially those who suffered very severe wounds such as amputees, that meant living the rest of their lives with disabilities. Until the beginning of the 20th century, disease almost always claimed many more lives than combat, often double or more. By far, the major killers of armies throughout the ages has been gastrointestinal infections, things such as dysentery, cholera, enteric fever, otherwise known as typhoid. It was not until the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05 that both sides actually managed to limit deaths from disease to fewer than those of combat deaths. In Vietnam, Australian troops were coming to a country that had one of the worst infectious disease environments in the world. They faced a multitude of gastrointestinal diseases, as well as worms, hepatitis, scrub typhus, and encephalitis. Malaria, however, presented the biggest problem, and some strains had become resistant to chloroquine, paliodrine, and so they introduced a new treatment called dapsone to combat these. The Australian medical system in Vietnam saw nearly 1,000 hospital admissions due to malaria alone, and 1968 was the worst year when there was an epidemic of 440 cases. Soldiers also suffered from a range of skin diseases, infections, insect bites. As with other wars, venereal disease was another constant battle to be dealt with while soldiers were deployed. With some of these infections, there was also a lingering impact which saw some veterans continue to suffer from the effects after the war. Things such as recurrent bouts of malaria could be a problem, and some skin diseases and types of VD could be hard to entirely be rid of. Next, I'll just briefly talk about substance abuse. Unlike the US forces in Vietnam, where hard drugs such as heroin became a serious problem, especially late in the war, drug abuse among Australians was pretty uncommon. Even the use of cannabis was much lower among Australian troops. There were very few actual disciplinary charges against Australian troops for possessing or using it. Not exactly non-existent, but the evidence seems to indicate very low use, and it wasn't much of a problem. And I think a lot of it has to do with a variety of factors. Cultural. Australia hadn't, I don't think, caught on to drug use as much as the United States at that stage. And I think the culture within the Australian military and the discipline also limited drug use. Army units in Vietnam were usually about a 50-50 mix of regular soldiers and national servicemen. In the US Army, especially in the latter years, there were less and less regular servicemen and a higher proportion of conscripts. There were other, more everyday substances which could be a factor. While deployed in Vietnam, the availability of very cheap cigarettes and alcohol, mainly beer, led some to develop lasting habits. Because alcohol couldn't be enjoyed when outside the wire on patrol for infantry, for example, in hostile territory, upon return to the base at Nui Dat, soldiers would often go on absolute benders because their beer rations, which was generally 2 cans per day, would accumulate while they were away. So they could come home and there could be 20, 30, depends on how long they'd been out for. And sometimes that would all get consumed in one night. I guess you could put some of that down to a stress breaker. Being outside the wire for a long period of time, very stressful, I think. The cigarette ration for each man, the beer ration was 2 cans beer per day, and the cigarettes were supplied very, very cheap, about 10 cents a packet. I'm talking 1960s. For some, and I must stress some, not all, this became a habit that was hard to break, even when they returned home to civilian life, where reaching for cigarettes and alcohol in the immediate aftermath of a period of stress became the norm. And such habits led in turn for many to develop increased risk of heart disease and cancer. Statistics for these conditions for the Australian Vietnam veterans were high and have remained high, especially as veterans get older and especially among those who continued such habits. Following Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War, a long-running controversy over the possible health effects of herbicides among troops emerged. Another chemical factor was insecticides. They used pretty powerful insecticides over in Vietnam, around the base area, at Nui Dat and other locations such as quarters at Vung Tau, which was the logistics based on the coast. And this is a topic that's not been studied, insecticides that's not been studied anywhere near as much as herbicides, but I think it probably should have been. Unlike herbicides, soldiers were exposed to insecticides far more frequently, sometimes a few times a week. They would have men going around spraying the stuff everywhere around the base, even in the tents, which is this fellow using a fogging machine. He's spraying insecticides around the base. There would be regular aerial spraying of the Nui Dat base with insecticides as well. I think a lot of veterans who say they were sprayed with herbicides, Agent Orange, were actually mistaken or misremembering. Rather, they were regularly getting sprayed with insecticides. Still, some veterans were convinced their health problems had been caused by exposure to chemicals and that the battle for recognition and compensation went on for decades and became very bitter. Most scientific studies failed to find a strong link between herbicides used in Vietnam, low levels of exposure, and the health problems claimed. Studies went on for decades and decades, and I think that only in the last few years they've ceased, both in the United States and Australia. But governments slowly granted compensation for a small range of conditions attributable to chemical exposure, and as time went on they relaxed the rules and granted compensation for a wider range of conditions based on lower probability of causation. Level of exposure and dosage level of the contaminant dioxin in the herbicides have always been important factors, and they've always been difficult because there was so much variation in the two. Ultimately, stalemate set in. On the one hand, it could not be proved conclusively that Agent Orange caused health problems for Vietnam veterans and their families, but equally it could not be proved that it had not. Ultimately, I think governments slowly gave ground to veterans on this issue in the form of compensation and access to free treatment. Slowly, unfortunately, in part to try and end the bitter arguments over this controversial issue and get the veterans the health care that they needed. For some Vietnam veterans, the transition from soldier back to civilian was anything but straightforward. Some found it difficult to adapt to a society that seemed indifferent, while finding meaningful employment could also, for some, be a daunting task. Again, I stress here for some. Not all, by no means were all affected that way. Many returned home and picked up where they'd left, or started afresh and going on to lead successful or at least steady lives. To find some grounding, many joined established veterans organisations such as the RSL. There've always been stories of non-acceptance of Vietnam veterans by the RSL, and while I'm sure it's true in some cases, I believe it's one of those experiences that has been exaggerated. Indeed, the RSL maintained the largest number of Vietnam veterans. The other smaller associations had their origins in dissatisfaction with the RSL and the Department of Veterans Affairs, especially over the perceived lack of action on issues such as Agent Orange, psychiatric support, and adequate benefits in general for Vietnam veterans. And yet, in many ways, I think these smaller Vietnam-focused organisations, the Vietnam Veterans Association of Australia and the other one is the Vietnam Veterans Federation, made more impact with securing benefits and treatments. Among all the sources and research we did for the Vietnam Medical Legacies project, the recent one I was involved in at the War Memorial, we found both evidence of dissatisfaction among Vietnam veterans with the RSL and the Department of Veterans Affairs, but conversely, also those whose experiences with those organisations were the opposite, saying they'd had very positive experiences. I think part of it's a natural tradition where older veterans sometimes look down on younger ones. The First World War diggers did it to the Second World War ones, and in turn those generations sometimes maintained that their service, that service in Vietnam was not comparable to the World Wars. I think there was often a lack of understanding of each other's war experiences at play there, and the nature of different wars over time. There were different experiences and differing types of stresses from one war to another. I think there were three main factors that occur to me for the Vietnam War which differed from the World Wars. Number one, it was a war fought among the civilian population where it was sometimes difficult to tell friend from foe. And sometimes you would be confronted with civilian casualties. Secondly, Vietnam was also a war fought with no front lines. Ground conquered usually wasn't held, which sometimes led to feelings of futility among the troops. And the enemy could be anywhere around you, not just in front of you, which only added to uncertainty and stress. And thirdly, there was also the matter of the sharply declining support of the public at home during the Vietnam War. That changed considerably over 10 years, where public support at home was pretty good and strong, and by the late 60s and into the early 70s it fell away. So these things made for different kinds of stresses and morale issues, both during and after the Vietnam War. It's also important to stress the difference for regulars and NASHOs, the National Service conscripts, those young men who were conscripted under the National Service Act. For regulars, especially those who served in the army for many years, if not decades, Vietnam was just a part, although a significant part, of their overall service. Also, when they came home from their tour of duty in Vietnam, regulars continued their military service in a familiar organisation and with comrades who had experienced much the same. It was a much different experience, and I think a lot harder for national servicemen who, after coming home from Vietnam, suddenly found themselves back in the civilian world, and very suddenly, it could happen within 24 hours. We'd be in Vietnam and then the next day you're home in Australia. Back in the civilian world, alone, without much support, and some found that really difficult to adapt to. For those that did struggle, whether they were ex-regulars or nashos, the difficulties often manifested in two things over time. Two common things were alcoholism and workaholism. For some, that worked for a while, but ultimately led to burnout and collapse. Mental health also suffered. We must remember also the impact of war and how it affected veterans' families. For many, wives, mothers, children, the war continued at home in some capacity. Relationships strained under the weight of psychological trauma of war, physical injuries, financial hardship. Veterans who returned home with mental war wounds could seem distant or at times emotionally numb, leaving families to deal with a sometimes fraught home environment. Some children grew up in households shaped by that war, where fathers were away for a while and then returned a changed man. So now I'll talk a bit more about mental war wounds. As wars have resulted in soldiers, all wars have resulted in soldiers suffering mental war wounds. It's hardly surprising, really. Indications appear in records and writings going back to ancient times. As time went on, more and more evidence emerged, and this doesn't mean that mental trauma caused by war was increasing over time. It's because there were more official records and personal accounts being created and surviving over time. Certainly by the time of the 19th century, there's much more evidence. For example, from the Crimean War, the American Civil War, the Russo-Japanese War at the beginning of the 20th century. And this period also coincides with the advent of a new branch of medicine called psychiatry. So more medical professionals were studying the mind and trying to figure out what was happening. Lots of different terms were used which added to the confusion and still do. Terms such as nostalgia, soldier's heart, Da Costa's syndrome, neurasthenia, shell shock from the First World War, malingering, nervous, lack of moral fibre, a horrible one from World War II Air Force days, combat stress reaction, combat shock, combat fatigue, and since 1980, when it was introduced, the term post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. All these terms, old and new, refer to a range of symptoms and some commonalities. Some refer to a more immediate reaction, either before, during, or right after battle, while others refer to conditions that manifest much later, perhaps weeks, months, or even years following a traumatic event. Some Australian Vietnam veterans who had also served in Korea, Malaya and Borneo found the war in Vietnam harder, more exacting and more of a mental strain. And this strain tended to become more apparent as troops neared the end of their year-long tour of duty. Another factor was the anxiety and mental strain from the threat of booby traps and mines. You just never knew when you might be the unlucky one. Such weapons caused catastrophic wounds, especially to the lower half of the body. So the threat of these nasty weapons played on soldiers' minds, not surprisingly. Several veterans we spoke to recalled occasions where their men in their unit had psychological breakdowns in the field and had to be evacuated. One veteran we spoke to recalled a section commander who became unable to go out on operations again. And quote, "He was just a nervous wreck. He couldn't speak straight. He was shaking like a leaf. He'd just had enough. He reached his breaking point, and it's a terrible, sad thing to see. It really is. They left him out of battle for one operation thinking perhaps he might come good, but he didn't, and they sent him home." As another example, following the Battle of Long Tan in August 1966, 3 soldiers had to be evacuated suffering severe battle stress. I'm surprised there weren't more than 3. Yet, psychiatric problems never constituted a major issue during deployment. Compared to earlier wars, it seemed that incidence was lower in Vietnam. There, for example, the Australian Army recorded a total of only 500 psychiatric admissions out of its more than 41,000 servicemen and women who served there between 1965 and 72. So that's just an incidence rate of 1.3%. And of those 500 psych cases, only about 100 were diagnosed as actual combat fatigue, kind of the equivalent at that time of the term shell shock. But the true figure of combat fatigue or combat shock is thought to be higher. And this is because different military psychiatrists had differing diagnoses and methods for dealing with psychiatric cases. They rotated, numerous military psychiatrists rotated through deployments to Vietnam, so it was never a really consistent approach. Some were treated more as disciplinary cases, others were simply moved to other units or sent home. And yeah, there was a lack of consistency. Later in the war, the unofficial policy of last resort was to reassign soldiers who suffered psychological problems to duties back in Australia. But if it appeared psychological problems among soldiers were lower in the Vietnam War, it proved to be something of an illusion. Apart from underdiagnosis and underreporting, there were other factors more unique to the Vietnam War which made it different to earlier conflicts. These factors included tours of duty being limited to 1 year instead of the duration of the war like it was in the World Wars. Also, the speed of return to civilian life after deployment was much quicker for Vietnam, and differing replacement systems. With regards to the latter, the Americans replaced individuals in units as vacancies occurred, while the Australians deployed as entire units for their year-long tours of duty and then came home as entire units, for the most part. It is thought that while these factors may have limited psychological problems during deployment, it probably just delayed them, bringing us to the longer-term mental issues such as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. 20 years after the war ended, 1995, there were 7,135 Australian Vietnam veterans receiving benefits and treatment for mental health disorders. Of those, about 2,000 were diagnosed with PTSD, and that figure continued to rise over the next 30 years. So more recently, in 2023, there were 18,654 Vietnam veterans receiving treatment and/or compensation for PTSD. That's almost half of surviving Vietnam veterans. And I think it's good that today there's much better help for those suffering PTSD. And there's much greater awareness and appreciation of it these days. But a continuing problem seems to be the lack of psychiatric professionals, the availability of them. There just aren't enough of them. And I think that's something that affects both the realm of military and civilian. On mental health, veterans today, I think, owe a debt of gratitude to the Vietnam veterans for their campaigning and practical work in setting up and expanding these services. Starting with the Vietnam Veterans Counselling Service, we now have its successor organisation, Open Arms, that's available not only to Vietnam veterans, but younger ones too, and importantly, their families as well. Sadly, one serious repercussion of PTSD is an elevated risk of suicide. After the war, the Agent Orange Royal Commission found that suicide rates among Vietnam veterans were lower than for Australian males of the same age. That was despite anecdotal evidence both among veterans and in the media that the rate was in fact alarmingly high. but reliable figures were hard to find. And this was the mid-1980s with the Royal Commission. However, later mortality studies found, conducted by the Department of Veterans Affairs, determined that between 1973 and 1995, 241 Australian Army Vietnam veterans had committed suicide, which was about 14% higher than the general population. This raised number was entirely among Army veterans, with figures for Navy and Air Force being about the same as for the general public. Perhaps the most alarming finding was another study that found that children of Vietnam veterans were 3 times more likely to die by suicide than children of non-veterans. And this is part of what's often referred to as intergenerational trauma. So it's good that that has been recognised and needs to be dealt with. Suicide among veterans has continued to be a problem in Australia, including those who served in more recent conflicts. And I really hope that the recently concluded Royal Commission will at last bring some real improvements and real solutions. So just to conclude, the aftermath of the Vietnam War and its legacies for surviving Australian veterans is varied and complex. While some went on to lead successful, happy lives after the war, some didn't. For them, the legacies of that brutal and controversial war lingered. For some, it was physical wounds or health problems. For others, it could be the psychological scars that remain. In 2023, there were 47,742 Vietnam War veterans with a condition accepted by the Veterans Affairs for which they were receiving treatment and or compensation. I think, as I mentioned before, the figure of 18,654 with PTSD represents 39%. A few thousand more had conditions such as alcohol dependence, depression, anxiety. Other conditions include tinnitus, hearing loss, osteoarthritis, alcohol dependence and depression. Tinnitus was a surprisingly high one. I can understand hearing loss, but I guess the two are related. Lots of loud noises. The central finding of the Memorial's Vietnam Medical Legacies project, which resulted in the book The Long Shadow, was that overall the mental and physical health of our Vietnam veterans is significantly worse than for other Australians of the same age group. And ultimately, that is the personal price they have paid for their service. Australia's Vietnam veterans deserve our respect for their service in that terrible long war. They did what their country asked of them, and they served with distinction and honour. And some came home bearing the scars, both physical and mental, sometimes facing indifference and scorn. And some carried that weight for years to come. It's a shame they were not shown more respect and appreciation sooner. Thank you. Question time, is it? Any questions at all? Yes.
Thank you very much. My question, I guess, is about the attitude of the Australian community to the Vietnam vets at the time of the war and possibly subsequently. I started university, I have just left school in 1969, and I was pretty amazed when I arrived at university, and it wasn't a radical university, it was a rural university, to find in the early parts of the first term, money being raised to send to support the Viet Cong. And I know it was a controversial war. I actually had another brother who'd been called up. He didn't actually go to Vietnam. But that had quite an impact on me, and I think that the current out of that, the way the veterans were treated when they returned, particularly the conscripts who were, as you said, pretty much dumped on the street. Do you think the Australian community has grown up since then? Because it seems that our veterans from Middle East wars have not encountered anything like what the Vietnam fellows did. Notwithstanding, non-existent weapons of mass destruction, so there may well have not been a particularly good basis for those men being sent off to war as well. So, your comments, please, on whether the treatment of the Vietnam vets and have we actually grown up since?
Yeah, good question. I think that the Australian public in general did learn something from the treatment of Vietnam veterans, and really the watershed was the Welcome Home Parade for the Vietnam veterans in October 1997 up in Sydney. It was followed 5 years later by the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial on ANZAC Parade in Canberra. Again, strong veterans turnout and marches there. I think it was a watershed for both veterans themselves, who, for many of them, it was a really strong turnout, both by veterans and a huge turnout by the public, which all of a sudden gave these veterans some form of recognition and public support. The public was there saying, we recognise what you went through, we appreciate you, after many, many years. And the veterans themselves were able to reconnect with each other. Many of them had not seen each other since they were in Vietnam, and a lot of them said that, this is really quite cathartic, because we learned just by talking to each other that, we're all kind of experienced quite similar homecoming issues. One of which was the mental health side of it too, where a lot of the veterans, it took them many, many years to accept that they had PTSD. And quite often it'd be either a former comrade who just said, look, you've just got to go and get some help, it's as clear as day. Or a partner, a wife. But often it'd take a long, long time. Sorry, I'm getting sidetracked a bit there, but yeah, look, I think that the Australian public, there was some level of regret at what happened with the treatment of Vietnam veterans. Not so much like the individual attacks, that's another area which I think has been exaggerated, where there might have been a handful of vindictive personal attacks, and quite often, and this is often done by the media, they beat it up and till you get the impression that it happened a lot more than it actually really did. One example, like the myth of bringing soldiers back from Vietnam in the middle of the night, like 3 o'clock in the morning, to avoid protesters, just a total myth. There's no evidence to support it at all. So I think there was a level of understanding among the public as when veterans were coming home from service in Timor, Iraq, Afghanistan, places like that, is that they should not be treated in the same way, even if it's just indifference and lack of appreciation, is what the Vietnam veterans copped a bit. Yeah. Yes?
Vietnam was the first televised war. Were there good and bad parts to that from either the vets or the rest of the community?
The first televised war, as I said, if you chose to follow it during the news, you get an update on it every night with real footage of combat and an update on what was happening in the war. It did have an effect, especially in the United States, I think, when you think of that TV footage from around the Tet Offensive in the end of January 1968, which by all accounts, really changed public sentiment, strongly anti-war, at least in the United States. Australia followed soon after. Yeah, I think that was something that perhaps the military in subsequent wars after Vietnam, Timor, Iraq, Afghanistan, other places, thought not to repeat. I think coverage was a fair bit more limited in some of those subsequent wars because I think they were mindful of the power of persuasion that TV footage had with the public. Yeah. Yes, Simone.
You mentioned fairly early on that you thought that insecticides might have caused problems with events, and there hasn't really been a lot of study into that. I was just wondering if there was any kind of study of that at all.
Yeah, there are really only a couple of articles, but certainly no in-depth studies. And again, the types of insecticides they used over there, they ranged, there's a whole lot of different ones. Some of them were probably a bit more standard and not quite as potent, but some of them were like real industrial strength, very, very potent chemicals. And as I mentioned, this is the stuff that got sprayed around where you lived, where you slept. There's only been a small amount of people that have really pushed for more understanding on more research into the effects of those insecticides. I think that Department of Veterans Affairs, their attitude was they wanted to keep it narrowly focused on herbicides. All right? They didn't want to complicate the matter by broadening it to insecticides. And I think it's probably a little bit of a cynical view, that it made it easier for DVA to deal with that issue if they kept it narrowly on herbicides and not more broadly on other chemicals, if that makes sense.
Well, they were still fogging in the early 2000s, and I remember still dipping my cams in liquids that they said not suitable for human use
Right.
in the early 2000s, so there's probably no way that they want to continue to look into insecticides. They were still using it well beyond Vietnam.
Yeah.
Would have been like 2016, we stopped rubbing on our skin.
Right, yeah. Yeah.
Still wore it, just not on skin.
Yeah. And then there's also been different types of anti-malarials, over time, as when you go from what they used in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and then more, 21st century, those things are continued to develop as well. And there's also been reports with some of them. I think the one they used in Vietnam, dapsone, that could cause complications. It was mixed with some of the other chemical anti-malarials, but I think they've only attributed one actual death to a reaction to dapsone. But with anything like that, there can be risks. Yeah. Yes.
Question on some of my reading on the Vietnam War. Certainly in the early years, there was an issue with those that got killed in action in terms of repatriating the bodies back to Australia. But the army didn't sort of automatically take that on. There was some rule that that was a family responsibility. Was that become an issue of morale for the troops over there?
Oh, I think so. If not for the troops, and certainly for the families at home, and there was quite an outcry about that. So some of the very early casualties, the deaths in the Vietnam War, Australian, were buried in Malaya. But then quickly there was a bit of an outcry, and I think it was 1966, if memory serves, that they changed that rule that the Australian war dead would be brought back to Australia and buried or cremated here. And I think they also came to the party with those that had already been buried in Malaya as well. And there's still a couple that are buried in Malaya where the family chose to just, we'll just leave them there. Yeah.
Probably slightly off track.
Was there, so I'll go two questions here. Was there any Australian POWs in the Vietnam War? That's the first question. And the second one relates more to the wars overall and the changing views on dealing with mental health. For instance, I know in the Second World War they were given cigarettes, and that was sort of like and then that became an issue for compensation later.
Mm.
And you mentioned also about shell shock. My mother-in-law at the time, when we were taking her to Sydney, she started reminiscing in the mountains, and she mentioned the Hydro Majestic was the place where they had all the war wounded in the war, so it would have been the Second World War. And she mentioned shell shock as well. And so the impacts of the servicemen and women in those days compared to now, have we made progress?
Yeah, thanks. The first part of the question, Vietnam, there were no Australians taken prisoner by the enemy. There were some missing, a small number missing, but over the years they've managed to find the remains of all of them. Yeah, as for dealing with mental war wounds over time, the understanding and appreciation of what it is and how to treat it changed a lot between the First World War, Second World War and Vietnam, and the understanding of the general population as well. For a lot of cases, it was dealt with as a disciplinary matter, and also what do they call it? Like being charged with malingering, or even being genetically predisposed to mental weakness, that sort of thing. I mean, more and more research on that has proven that that's totally false, really. And in the Second World War as well, a lot of it was, unfortunately they didn't learn a lot of lessons between the first. They learned so much during the First World War, but a lot of it I think was forgotten between the First and the Second World War, and some respects they forgot a lot and had to relearn what was happening, dealing with Australian psychiatric casualties in the Owen Stanley Ranges on the Kokoda track at Tobruk as well. They had like a large psychiatric ward in Tobruk, which was actually being bombed all the time, which is not a great place to evacuate psychiatric casualties. So they had to kind of relearn a lot of stuff. They rebadged things, and instead of shell shock, they used terms like combat shock, war neurosis, and in a lot of cases, it was what happened in Vietnam too, with certain military medical professionals. There's a tendency to sweep the problem under the carpet and underdiagnose what was really happening. And part of that is, as always, between the military, the regimental medical officers, whether they be psychiatric specialists or not, there's always this pressure to, on the one hand, you've got to try and get as many men back to their units capable of fighting as possible, opposed to doing what you should be doing as a medical professional and giving patients the treatment that they need. And that's often a pretty difficult thing for them to do. Sorry, that's probably a bit of a roundabout way of addressing what you said. Yes?
It's easier to remain seated and say nothing, but I'd like to say something briefly, as concisely as I can. I'm Don Graham. I've been a resident of Dubbo since I was about that big. I've been a resident of Dubbo since I was about that big. And thank you, Craig, for a very well presented and interesting talk, but a very sad talk. And Grandpa Graham was a returned serviceman from World War I, and it's a little emotional for me. We'd go down there about Easter and things like that and visit them. And Grandpa Graham had a market garden, a poultry farm and a cow in Reesby, near Bankstown in Sydney. And I don't think you'd find too many poultry farms in the area today. He was a brilliant man. He was tall, very lean, and walked with a limp. As he was a TPI, totally and permanently incapacitated veteran from that first war. And I remember he had a bucket, galvanised bucket with broken bricks in it in the back garden where the big banana trees grew from the rich lawn clippings, and he'd swing that bucket on the paralysed side. And he'd sit on the back veranda in the sun and he'd recite a poem. And one day I'm going to find out what this poem's about. Because the only verse in it I can remember is he'd say, when the meat would walk to you. And on the battlefield there wouldn't be any refrigeration in World War I. And I think of the years by and best before dates we've got today, we've lost the plot. Because you know what's work in the hospital system cleaning up wounds. So a quick wash and they'd eat the meat. So this is the getting towards the quick end of it, I trust. General MacArthur was a controversial figure, but one of the most notable things I ever heard anyone say, when General MacArthur said, warfare is mankind's greatest madness. No one wins a war, it's just that one side loses less than the other. And the last issue is with women. Most of you be aware of what the suffragettes went through in England to try and get some equal values for women. And I don't agree with the terrible things they did, but I agree with their right to speak up. And I feel that women, and I've had this view for a long while, have equal say as men from the year dot. We'd have far fewer wars, because wifey would say to hubby, wake up yourself, you silly old bugger. Thank you very much.
Oh, yes.
I just had a question about the veterans associations and groups that sort of came out and were developed by veterans post-war. Was that largely among national servicemen, or was that a combination and due to the sort of lack of support and lack of recognition by government and DVA areas?
Yeah, it was the Vietnam Veterans Association, which led Vietnam Veterans Association of Australia. They started out really as a protest agitation group, especially on the issues such as lack of progress on the issue of Agent Orange, compensation in general, and psychological treatment, for sure. Whether they were mostly Nashos or regulars, I don't know, but I do know that there were both in the organisation. So yeah, they weren't just Nashos. And they played a really important part in setting up the Vietnam Veterans Counselling Service. The veterans tell you that they did it all themselves. The truth is they did it in combination with the government. The government did work with them on it, but they really pushed it along. And some of the veterans as well got qualifications as psychiatrists and worked in these places, helping their former comrades. Because the established during the First World War was Returned Soldiers, Sailors, Imperial League of Australia, which eventually became the RSL, and it was the largest organisation. They were in the 70s and 80s. They were still very much focused on huge veteran populations. There's still lots of World War I guys around, and heaps of World War II men and women, and they weren't very focused. Unfortunately, not focused enough on Vietnam veterans, and they felt that They were just being sidelined a bit, I think. Yeah.